Hello and welcome to this Fane online event. My name's Louise Kennedy and I am absolutely thrilled to be here to talk to Alan Murrin about his extraordinary new novel, a debut novel, The Coast Road. Alan is a writer from County Donegal in Ireland. He was the winner in 2021 of the Bournemouth Writing Prize for his short story, The Wake, which also went on to be shortlisted for Short Story of the Year at the Irish Book Awards. He writes for the Irish Times, Times Literary Supplement, and Spectator. As a novel in progress, The Coast Road was shortlisted for the Peters Fraser Dunlop Queer Fiction Prize and longlisted for the Caledonian New Novel Award. And Alan is also the recipient of an Irish Arts Council Next Generation Artist Award. The reception already to this book has been really pretty incredible, and it hasn't hit the shelves yet. So just an example of some of the comments, that the response from some early readers. The writer Sarah Winman, who's the best-selling author of Still Life, said Alan Murrin writes with the calm, poetic fluency of the best of Irish writers. A stonkingly good novel. Just read it. Gillian Anderson, who doesn't need any introduction, said, I love this novel. All the female characters are complex and fascinating and full of anger and hope. I found it an addictive read. I also got a chance to read it early, and I said that Alan is a gifted storyteller. His characters so fully realised I fretted for them as I read. It's a beautiful, accomplished debut. So I've just reread the novel, Alan, over the weekend ahead of talking to you. And there's so many things that I hope we get a chance to talk about over the next hour or so. But I think that maybe the very first thing would be for you to tell everybody who's watching or listening in your own words what The Coast Road is about.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it is an exploration of three marriages in free fall, really. With one marriage, we're wondering, will they be able to make it work? Will the wife stay? In one marriage, we're wondering, will she be able to claim back her old life? And in the third one, we're wondering, is she going to be able to escape? Because she's in a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the setting, Alan, Alan and myself both live in roughly in the same part of Ireland in the northwest. I'm a little bit further south, and Alan apparently can see Sligo, where I live, from his home place in Donegal. So this book is the setting is like really, really important. And actually, I suspected, you never named Killybegs, but I suspected it was Killybegs for lots of reasons. There were lots of things that really resonated. So can you talk to me about place and how that fed into the work and the writing of it, or even the conception of it, if that was a thing?
Yeah, no problem. So in some respects, I feel like the story on the one hand could be set anywhere. It could be any small town, to the extent that small towns are the world in microcosm, and are the perfect place to set a good yarn because everybody knows everybody, which ups the stakes, and gossip fuels everything, etc., etc. But I think maybe why this story works is that it's both that kind of universal thing, but also it's a very specific geographical and historical, cultural, political location. There's so much going on at this particular time in 1994. I grew up in a town and in a time where Ireland was not a very wealthy country, but actually Killybegs was a thriving fishing port. And people there were relatively well off. I mean, obviously there's a scale to these things, but it was an economically thriving community. And that, of course, creates its own dynamic because you have the haves and the have-nots living cheek by jowl, and it was specifically a time when, and I write about this a little bit in the book, there'd been huge EU investment in the fishing industry when Ireland joined the European Union. And Killybegs is this sort of like blessed little haven. It's a natural harbour with this very deep harbour that by sheer chance is kind of the perfect place to set sail off into the Atlantic and catch.
Yeah, and can take those massive big trawlers where the fishing can be, where there can be processing done on those big boats and stuff. So I guess maybe what did that probably elevated, probably hundreds of years of people going out to fish on small boats into this like much, much, much bigger commercial thing that was probably lucrative for some people.
And now actually that the fishing has gone down somewhat and it's not thriving in the same way. Killybegs making during the summer, the enormous cruise ships are able to make it into the harbour.
Oh, wow.
And actually, it's one of the only harbours that can facilitate boats. Big.
Wow.
But as well, it was 1994. All of the things that were going on. Divorce is still illegal, which has ramifications for the characters in the book. The church is embroiled in every scandal imaginable. Your priest was your marriage counsellor. And what does a priest know about marriage? It's one of the great.
Yeah, see, I find that part I found particularly fascinating. So in a very early life, much earlier part of my life, I'm a social science graduate, and I did that in Dublin in the 1980s. And one of my lecturers went on to write a book that he called Moral Monopoly, and it was about the Catholic Church's stranglehold on Irish society. As a sociologist, he was looking at it in a particular way. But one of the things, the most memorable things that he said, which was something that I think we all knew, but I just never heard it put this way before, was that that priests were basically agents of social control, particularly over women, because women went to the priest and told them everything. So they knew all of this. And I really thought about that in where there's one scene where I guess there's a couple of different aspects. There's one of the women in the one of the characters, Izzy, has visits from the priest all the time, and I guess this is he's a sort of a Father Brian Trendy type, isn't he?
Yes, exactly.
Where he thinks that it's this some sort of he has this like pastoral role where it's this community outreach, yeah, I wondered about him and just about where he came from, because he's sort of complicated in a way.
Yeah, he's I suppose one of the things that I was interested in was Izzy is someone who wants to make her marriage work. She and I think something that she finds attractive about this man, Father Brian, he's a version of her husband who listens to her. He is, I didn't write it in the book, but in as much as I feel like all men over the age of 50 in 90s Ireland looked exactly the same, Father Brian and James are almost, they're like twins in my head.
Interesting. Yeah.
In terms of their physical appearance. And it is relevant as well that he had a life before he became a priest. He came to the priesthood late. So he comes in with a different viewpoint and vantage point on life. And also there is the aspect that Izzy is someone who has an inner life that hasn't been realized and that she's desperately trying to access. And she can talk to this man about books. And they share one of their things is to share novels with each other. So, he facilitates that sort of creative aspect.
I love that. Even the detail of that is great, that he didn't get on the best with Doris Lessing and stuff like that.
I know. And I mean, yeah. And I mean, I guess it's unusual to a degree that the priest is the only man in it who is nice.
Yeah, he is nice, and at the same time as well, though, I mean, he is nice, but I just think maybe it's just something that it's maybe about my own kind of I mean, I guess they are nearly hang-ups about the church and everything to do with it. I mean, I'm certainly not into anybody who has faith to get on with it, but I think there's just something about for all of us who had to live with the power that organization had as well. I guess for me, they're always kind of alarm bells. And
Well,
there's a bit of sexual tension as well.
yeah, and how nice can he be if he has gone through this process of becoming a priest? You have to toe the line to a certain degree.
That's it. Yeah. So he is volunteers. Not as a school leaver the way most priests are, where they're kind of groomed through school and then put through the system to turn out these sort of I don't know what they are. I mean, ideally these sort of bland kind of visionaries who just like steer the flock in a particular way. But he has chosen this, and what he's chosen. I mean, I suppose there is personal faith there with him, but he's also chosen to be an agent of this really repressive organization, and he's done that as a grown man, which is kind of interesting too.
And I suppose I kind of had to set him up in opposition to the other types of priests that were at that time, like the dictatorial bishop. But also, as you said, there is a tension between them. He is not a sexually blank or unthreatening person. He's full-blooded.
Yeah, and I guess that's something that Izzy's husband isn't blind to at all. That he
well, exactly. They talk about this other priest who was on the scene at one. I can't remember what I called him in the book, who was clearly gay. They have they joke about this and they laugh at him, and James didn't like him because he thought they found this aspect of him ridiculous. It sets him up in opposition to Father Brian as someone who is not like those other priests. And I was thinking a lot, and I don't think I've spoken to this about with anyone yet. I was thinking a lot about Carmela Soprano when I was writing this book. And she had that relationship with the priest who was always coming over to eat.
Always coming around, yeah.
Always coming around to eat. And at one point, I'm not even sure if I can say this word, because I'm not sure the resonance that it has, but it's kind of mafia word that they used. And at one point she says to him, wasn't it just my luck to get the only priest who wasn't a Fanook, which is... I think it's like an awful word that mafia used for a gay person.
Oh my God.
And, I was also interested in this aspect of her as a woman who was working she made a deal with the devil, and she had to work within those confines. And she had how do I make this situation work for me? There's also the kind of parallel that Irish politicians or politicians generally Gangster.
Yeah, that whole thing is just so well done too, Alan. I really felt, with James Izzy's husband, he's whatever the equivalent of an MP, except that in Irish political culture, that's much smaller. We are grossly overrepresented. I think there's well under 1,000 MPs in the British Parliament, and we have nearly 400, and a tiny population in relative terms, like less than 10. Have we got like 90% less of a population or something? It's insane. Yeah. So it means that there's this element of what do they call it, clientelism, where everybody knows, and they think that they can stop the TD on the street and tell him things, and they have to live in a small town. There's no getting away from it, really.
Yeah.
And how conscious he is of how he appears. So a lot of his motivation is that, isn't it?
It was essential that James was someone of importance in the community because he is obsessed with appearances. It's a big drive in the book for him and for the decisions that he makes. Yeah.
So then Colette. So this is Colette is the woman in the relationship who thinks that somehow she might be able to claim back what she's lost, that she might be able to get it back. Will you talk a bit about her or where she came from?
Yeah, absolutely. Colette has a lot to reclaim. She's lost a lot. I suppose when I was right, it's funny. Readers have really connected with Colette, and I suppose that's not surprising, really. I did set her up as the kind of woman, if you saw her walking down the street, you think, oh, there's Colette Crowley. And before you remember your prejudices. And that's the dynamic between her and Izzy. for me, I wanted to write. Izzy was supposed to be the star of the show, and she is to some degree, but other people take over, and certainly Colette has the starrier role. But Colette is sort of a representation of Izzy's fears, greatest fears and greatest desires writ large. That was the genesis of the book.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene somewhere in the middle where Izzy finds Colette drunk in the pub.
Mm-hmm.
And what it says to Izzy is that a woman like Colette, who is wealthy, educated, and sophisticated, she is not supposed to be behaving like that.
Mm-hmm.
There are other women who could do that. They wouldn't get with it, but that you could denounce, but it's not right that Colette is doing that. And I suppose what Izzy sees in Colette is someone who has the financial and creative freedom to be whoever she wants to be, but she also thinks to herself, if she can fall that low, then what's hope is there for the rest of us?
Mm-hmm.
That's really...
because I guess in a way that sort of it kind of threatens the social structure or something. It's just, you look at that and think, okay, things are like falling apart. And because I think it was maybe the 60s or something before respectable Irish women could go to the pub, and then there were certain parameters that it had to be in the company of their husband or as part of a family group. Or maybe at a push, they could go with a group of women if they'd just been playing bridge or something, but they couldn't just go to the pub like a man and sit at a bar.
I still think nowadays people in small towns would be a little bit...
Well, that's it, yeah, what she at, yeah.
Exactly what you do. Well, there is something suspicious about people doing things alone. Dolores comments on the fact that she keeps seeing Colette walking.
Yes.
And that she is walking by herself. And she says, where the fuck is she going?
Yeah.
It's like, what does she think she's doing? Walking all the time around some bend. Yeah. And there is this thing where your behavior is constantly being monitored. I have a friend from Waterford, and he's a bit older than me, but he said that his mother used to sit at the window and look out, and that there was this fella in the parish, and he'd go for a walk by himself. And when he went for a walk, he had this scarf that he'd throw over his shoulder, and she used to go, there he is, scarf.
It's a completely harmless pursuit, but it's like, what's going on?
And even last time I was at home in Donegal, I went for a walk, and I thought, left my mother's house, and I thought, I'm going to walk out and see my brother and my sister-in-law. It was the middle of the day, and I knew my sister-in-law would be there. And I stopped. I thought, can't go empty-handed. So I stopped to buy a bottle of wine. And I got the bottle of wine, and I thought to myself, do I need to buy a bag for this now? Because, people would be talking about you.
Exactly. You just like wheezing a bottle of wine by the neck going up the street or something.
And I thought, no, Alan, you're being ridiculous.
Oh my God.
It's not a big deal. So I bought the bottle of wine, and I headed out the road, carrying the bottle of wine by the neck. And when I got into the house, the first thing my sister-in-law said to me was, did you carry that out here like that?
You gotta love it. Yeah, so your instinct was right.
You can't be right for doing that.
I guess it's like it takes very little to be considered a beyond the pale in a small town. Yeah, any kind of behavior like that. So you talked as well. I have to say, I am demented about Dolores. I'm still distraught about Dolores.
I'm happy that you say that.
Oh my God.
I did not know she was going to play such a big part when I started to write the book. I also, she was the person I knew the least about, and I had to spend the most time getting to know. When I finally got an agent, one of the things we discussed was that the ending needed to be improved, shall we say. And part of improving that ending was me taking the time to get to know Dolores and allowing her to have agency, and allowing her to play a bigger part in the denouement. And she is, it was such a pleasure to get to know her better and to understand her desires, her sadnesses, her whole inner world.
And even, I just think that you've written that so well, when she's moving around the house, and just how she feels about how uncomfortable she is in her own body, how she feels about her appearance. And, there's one part where she, at one point she is looking at her daughter and sees, a version of herself, but like, the version of herself that she'd like to be or something, where she's prettier, and even comments on, that her hair, the curls of her hair are softer and stuff.
Yeah.
I just find some of that so heartbreaking. And the cleaning.
Yeah, those second houses, those new dormer bungalows that go up.
I know, that's it, and that's really good as well, because that idea of the landscape. That when I think is it Donal who looks down, or is it Donal and Colette and looks? Is it Donal looks down? He sees his own house and sees what it really looks like.
Yeah, how exposed it is, and how he can be seen.
But it's exposed as well. But just the plainness. There's something about the way the Irish countryside is. It is kind of wrecked, isn't it, by houses in fields with there's nothing. No, there's not really a garden to speak of. There'd be just like a line of conifers on either side to like wall in an acre, and then a trampoline for some reason. Why does everybody have a trampoline? But like not even a plant in a pot. Like no landscaping either. But houses that are, so I suppose meant to look majestic or something, because maybe these people got the land for free. Farmers, sons and daughters of farmers who get like a plot of land, but just that thing where it's sort of nearly there, but it's not quite. Like it just doesn't ever look homely or something.
Enormous uniform dormer bungalows built with the most extraordinary views, like
extraordinary views,
like looking at the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, it's amazing. So another thing that I was that I wondered about was dialogue. The dialogue is unbelievably good. Can you talk to me about that, or where you think that comes from?
I'm glad that you think the dialogue is really good. I would say that sometimes I find dialogue relatively easy to write because I can hear everything in my head.
Mm-hmm.
I can hear the voices. I'll act it out. I'll say it aloud. I will, when I get stuck, I'll go ahead and write the dialogue.
Okay, very good.
Some days if I'm really struggling to get the words on the page, I know what they say later. So I'll go ahead and do that. And I suppose if I set myself any challenge when I do it, and I think this is another thing that I've learned from watching good television, is I think to myself, what can they say in response to this that is absolutely correct, but not what you would expect them to say? So what I mean about that is, it's like when you watch good dialogue on TV, for example, or even in life, there's a call and response in language, isn't there, in communication? So it's like when someone says, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? The ear is already reaching out for I do. But the much interesting thing is to say, actually, can you give me a minute? That's but in the same way, with as I've observed from good TV, it lands at the end of the conversation. It lands at exactly the right and correct place. You were. It seems so satisfying. Do you know what I mean? And so, if there's any kind of like craft in the dialogue that I'm writing, it's that. It's to not have the person say the thing that your ear is reaching out for. Yeah, that's really good. I think as well that you capture, there's a kind of a shorthand between couples. There's a way that, so it is very much, a voice from the Northwest. I mean, which is your voice. But yet when the characters are speaking to each other, or even in their self-reflection, it's their voice, which I think is really hard to do. And you've totally pulled it off. So when there's a particular way that Izzy and James speak to each other. There's a sort of banter. And that's kind of interesting because there's still a bit of a spark there. Like she doesn't hate his guts, but she just doesn't want things to keep being the way they are. Is it good enough?
Exactly. But there's banter there all the time. Even when they're fighting, there's a bit of sparky banter. But yes, then the conversations between Donal and Dolores is totally different. Maybe that's about a power dynamic, because Izzy still has Izzy still has a bit of control. It's not, She's she has enough power in her relationship to, you know, put James into very bad form.
Oh, she's not some like passive wallflower.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And
Um,
that was something I was interested. I grew up around like dynamic women like that who thought men were completely useless and surplus to requirements. And they're kind of, that was their way of gaining control
mhm,
in the world. And I know what you mean. It's like you feel like Donal hates Dolores, but he
mhm,
doesn't hate Izzy. He loves her.
mhm.
He just a bit of a bastard, but he
Yeah.
he loves her. And the novel came from a short story called What Poets Do,
Mhm.
where and kind of the recurring motif was this little joke between James and Izzy about, bohemian Colette Crowley. Oh, that's what poets do, and which is, how Irish people undermine and kind of make fun and belittle people through these
Well,
little.
that's it. And also, I think Irish people, even though, like, you know, the way we get all thrilled if somebody, an Irish person, wins the Booker or if they win an Oscar or something like that. But yet, if you are a creative person, they think you're a bit mad.
Yeah. It's like poor Sinead O'Connor. The attitude that people
Oh God.
had towards her was that kind of the way Gay Byrne used to speak to her, like she was
It was like, are Sinead, are you all right?
the poor thing.
Yeah.
And Irish people are always like, oh God, she's talented, but she's mad.
Yeah. Bit touched.
And
Yeah.
the two things came hand in hand. It's so
Yeah.
patronizing. Yeah.
So actually, I have a question, but I don't know if you can answer it. So when I realized that it was likely to be a Killybegs setting, I remembered something. So I am not from Sligo, but I spent a bit of time here. I moved here in 2000 and I spent a bit of time here in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, there was a literary journal that Dermot Healy ran, and it was called Force 10. And there was a group of these stunning looking, beautifully dressed Donegal women who were poets who used to come down in very big cars
Yeah.
to do readings and things. Did you know about this?
No, I remember that I know, and I didn't know this at the time. I think I knew this when I was researching the book. There had been a Killybegs writers group.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I really very much thought of that, but they were very notable because any of the kind of creative people around Sligo were starving and
How funny, yeah.
hardly able to, get the price of a pint together after a reading. But the Killybegs women were really noticeable because they came down driving big Mercedes cars and stuff. And they were fabulously well dressed.
And well, I suppose like some people might think, when they read this book, oh, a poet in a small town. There were loads of poets
Of course
in
there
small
are,
towns.
absolutely.
So it was not a stretch of imagination for me to think that a housewife could be a poet.
Yeah.
That was perfectly. But I suppose, it's important to the story as well that and Izzy comments on this as well, that, Colette can sit around writing poems all day if she wants to, because she's not living off the books.
She's a cleaner and she's this and that. And so what else would she be doing?
Yeah. I love to be sitting around writing poems all day.
We could all be writing poems.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good crack. So I wonder, would you like to read? Would you read a wee bit for us?
Yeah, no problem. And I'll just read the opening section of the first chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ardglass, County Donegal, October 1994. There had been 2 masses already that morning, and the air was thick with incense. The church was packed, and Izzy found herself squeezed between 2 bodies. Each time she went from kneeling to sitting to standing, she felt their shoulders press against hers. She pulled a balled-up tissue from her sleeve and wiped the sweat from her forehead. She thought of removing her jumper, but wasn't sure if the top she had on underneath was decent, and besides, she'd never managed the manoeuvre without hitting the person next to her or exposing some part of her flesh. She didn't think she could suffer an embarrassment like that this morning. Raising her head, she was confronted by the sight of Stacia Toomey's broad back looming before her. Stacia stood stately and proud, tightly wrapped in a coat of royal blue gabardine. Kneeling again, Izzy caught the smell of sweat rising from her armpits. She bowed her head and closed her eyes. And then the responses started. She took a long, slow breath. Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy. She had managed to drag herself out of bed for 11:30 Mass. It was one thing to have been drinking, but to stay in bed with a hangover was to admit you had been drunk. She rarely drank to excess, so she wasn't going to give James the satisfaction of using this against her. She'd slipped out of the spare room to make a cup of tea, saw the pictures lying scattered across the floor. The night before, when they returned from the local business's dinner, she'd insisted to James that she was sleeping downstairs in the spare room. She went careening down the hallway, knocking every picture frame off the wall. James had grabbed her arm and she'd planted an elbow in his ribs. He'd let out a roar, and of course, Niall and Orla had woken. And that was the image she couldn't get out of her head. The two of them conjoined in horror, staring down at her from the landing. She'd hurried back to bed with her cup of tea so as not to have to face any of them, but now as she knelt in the church, the collective responses to the prayers rising and falling in her empty stomach, she wished she'd eaten something. Christ have mercy, Christ have mercy. She tried to focus on Father Brian, the solid shape of him behind the altar. He was decked out in his Sunday finery, his vestments so clean and crisp and trimmed in shades of gold and silver, the stole embroidered with tight little bunches of grapes and ears of wheat. She reminded herself to say this to him next time he visited her. You were all decked out in your finery last Sunday, Brian. It suited you. The finest dress I've seen you in so far. Because she knew that this was the part of the job he hated most, that it would forever be an embarrassment for him to present himself to people in this way. She thought of the wry smile he'd offer when she said this, the gentle putter of his laugh. O Lord, it is your will that all shall be saved. Someone near the front of the church rose. A tall woman with a mane of black hair stepped up and turned to face the lectern. Izzy felt a sharp little breath escape her. Colette Crowley, she thought, in all her glory. Such a fine-looking woman, it did you good just to rest your eyes upon her. The way she held her head so high, the length of her, the graceful tilt of her chin. And as she looked out at the congregation, a smile played about her lips for a moment, like there was something funny to her about all of this, like she'd played a trick on them, like she'd never really left at all. Izzy saw Stacia Toomey nudge her husband. A few people were overcome by a fit of coughing. She cast an eye around to see if Sean or Anne were present, but couldn't spot them anywhere. And then Colette spoke in that beautiful, soft Dublin accent of hers, a reading from the prophet Isaiah. But Izzy was not listening to the words, just the sound of her voice. She was neither a coarse Jackie nor a pretentious Southsider. She was something else altogether, and Izzy could have listened to her all day. And people stared up at her like the vision she was, and when Izzy's eyes drifted across the altar to where Father Brian was seated in his big marble chair, she saw the soft, sympathetic look he offered to Colette Crowley. Give the Lord power and glory. That was the response Colette demanded of them, and Izzy thought that a bit bombastic. Hadn't he power and glory enough? And then Colette descended from the lectern, stepping carefully, minding the hem of her long skirt. A shuffling of bodies filled the silence that had fallen over the church. Izzy watched Stacia Toomey's gaze track Colette all the way down the aisle, the hard set of her jaw only easing when Colette had kneeled in her pew. But Father Brian did not move from where he was seated. He looked so still, so poised, his hands resting delicately on his knees like he was meditating over every word Colette had said. Izzy brought the tissue to her brow, but there was nothing in her hand. She looked down and saw the tissue scattered across the hassock like snow.
Gorgeous. Amazing. So are you a plotter? Like, did you plot in advance, or did you write into the abyss, or how did you approach writing the novel? Because you've already said that your starting point was a short story.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I am a plotter, and I mentioned that this came from a story called What Poets Do. I felt like there was something worth pursuing in that, and I just took the components of that and thought, how do I raise the stakes? And then so I'd written a novel in my 20s that didn't work. It was, I could see that there was something about it that just wasn't. I finished it, and I really feel like I cut my teeth on it, and I used it as my application then for my master's. And that successfully got on the program, etc. So I felt like, it had all that time hadn't been wasted. But I had not plotted. And out of sheer terror of investing the same amount of time again and not getting anything out of it, I thought, I'm going to put a framework in place that sees me. I wrote a first draft really quickly. I wrote it in, I think, 3 or 4 months.
Hmm.
A certain number of words to hit a day in a certain number of hours. But I would say that not a single word of that draft has remained unchanged.
Yeah, I've done things like that as well. That's what I did with Trespass, and then I've done it again with another book. Yeah, so it's just this draft two is a massive repair job.
And it doesn't matter if you've put some, plot points in place. The storyline completely changed, and it is endlessly surprising the things that the characters do anyway. So you just like put a bit of I needed that discipline for it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting with characters like that, isn't it? Where you think that maybe you think you have an idea of where they're going, and then you start to fling shit at them, and how they react is kind of amazing, isn't it?
And I think
they do things that you never think they're going to do.
It's the combination of the two things, though. I don't know if you would agree with this. It's the combination of giving yourself like a few plot points to kind of, or knowing a bit of what happens, and actually writing a first draft relatively quickly. Because that's where the surprises come in. It's when you're like, I just have to get this done.
Yeah.
And that worked for me. It also does the very clever thing of when you have a draft, it tricks you into thinking you've written a book.
Yeah.
So you're like, oh, so no, all I have to do now is
the end. And you're delighted with yourself for about a day until you open the laptop again and realize that you've got about 2 years of hell ahead of you.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm working on something else at the moment, and I have a few drafts into it. And every day I look at it, I'm like, this is a pile.
Oh, it's shocking. Yeah. So you have to play some tricks yourself, But then again, I think so. What I loved was the writing group. And so you talked a little bit there. You mentioned your own path to writing. And I wondered, were you ever in a writing group?
Well, like oh no, the only thing I have to compare it to would be a creative writing workshop on my master's.
Okay.
Is a slightly more elevated situation than the Hourglass writing group.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
It's not entirely dissimilar.
No, not entirely. There is something that's really strange, isn't it? The dynamic in those rooms, and you start to realize that there are people who aren't there for their writing to improve. Some of them are there to be flattered.
Yeah.
And even though it's supposed to be a workshop, and then you kind of realize that they don't want anybody to say, oh, that transition had me confused, or maybe you don't need that extra character. They don't want that at all. They just want you to say it's amazing and you're amazing.
And a friend of mine who I did my master's with read these sections and read Coast Road and then went, I can't believe you did that. I feel betrayed. Now everyone will know how stupid what we do is.
That's very funny. But I love the kind of small town thing. The randomness. Like I could nearly picture the man that retired. Was he a retired doctor?
Yeah.
Who had put on photographs. He put on exhibitions of himself of his own photographs and things. But yet the man wasn't creative at all, really. He was completely literal about all of the instructions and stuff, and just couldn't, just couldn't approach any of the tasks. Like it wasn't really. He fancied himself as a creative person, but he wasn't really. God love him. But all of that is great.
Those scenes were really fun to write, but on a more serious note, they also provided a kind of balance where it really exposed Izzy's desires to be taken seriously, to discover something of her inner life. There's something, I always find those moments in narratives deeply sad, where people, are embarking on these journeys of self-discovery, and they don't have to be doing a PhD for that to be affecting and meaningful.
Absolutely, that's for sure. I think as well, that was like, I think it's at the end of the chapter where they're at the first meeting of the writing group, and a woman has turned up, and she's not, she doesn't live. Everybody knows who she is, but and everybody knows that her home life is dreadful, and she begins to write and writes and writes and writes and writes and writes, and then leaves. And Colette, who's hosting the group, says, "Oh, she'll be back," and Izzy says, "No, she won't."
No, yeah, and
that really broke my heart.
And that's one of those things that you can't plan for when you're writing. I didn't know she was going to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or
then,
that she was gonna freak out.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
kind of like I think representation of how Izzy feels like she could behave if she allowed her emotions to let loose.
Mm-hmm.
That could be me. That's, I have this dark inner life as well. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it was also a means for me. I wanted to show as many different versions of being married
Mm-hmm.
that there are at that were at that
Mm-hmm.
time. And she is a woman whose husband, she's the rich woman whose husband openly cheats on her,
Mm-hmm.
and she's still in the marriage. That existed too. It wasn't like everyone had these saintly marriages, or that they were even trying to hide their behavior.
Yeah, that's very interesting because the divorce referendum, and I suspect you're going to have a lot of people who aren't Irish who are going to be really, really, really shocked and interested in the fact that you couldn't get a divorce in Ireland
Yeah,
at that
it's a
time.
big selling point for the book.
Yeah, but I see. I wonder about that as well because really the thing is that Irish people's marriages were falling apart left, right, and centre anyway. But
Yeah.
that was about the right to remarry.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. And Louise, when I sat down to write the book, I didn't think to myself, I'm going to write a book about the divorce referendum.
Yeah.
I literally just thought, oh, suppose, 1994, I was an adolescent, things are particularly memorable, period of time. Everything is new, your brain is fresh, you're very responsive to things. So it was kind of redolent.
And there's that kind of, there's a dawning understanding of the adult world around you or something like that. And also maybe if you're the sort of child who's curious and who listens and watches and notices things as
which
well.
I was sitting listening to my mammy talking with her friends. And then I thought, oh, well, I suppose if you can't get divorced, that adds another layer of tension to it. It became much more meaningful when I was writing it. And I think this is probably something that you experience when people talk to you about your own writing as well, because the political context is in Trespasses was so important. But people weren't sitting around thinking about the impact of politics on their lives.
No, they weren't at all. I mean, it was coming in. It was coming in all the time. But they were still worried about, whose turn it is to do the dishes
no woman was going to be saying, I'm voting yes, because that was like saying that your marriage wasn't working.
Yes.
And that's deeply shameful too. And then the other thing was that.
And also, I guess there were women who wouldn't have wanted to vote yes, because there were women who knew that their husbands were acting the maggot and who didn't want to be put in a position where they'd be put out of their house, or that things, they'd be forced out of marriages and forced out of what they saw was their position in the world.
Or to be like, I've put up with you for long enough. You can.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And then the thing about the characters in this book as well is that actually the divorce referendum hasn't been announced. They don't know it's a possibility. They're not thinking I'm going to be in a situation where I can get divorced. The only people about it are the clergy and Izzy, because her husband is a politician. But it was interesting when I started doing a bit of research. I have a friend who is a barrister and specialised in family law. I got her to take a few photographs of books in the law library for me. And one of the big fears of the government at the time was that if they legalised divorce, that men would be divorcing their wives in droves because the women were so annoying. And all of the applications were
from women.
Yeah. Or the majority of the applications were.
Oh my God. And also what they predicted didn't happen. There wasn't an avalanche of people running out of their marriages. All it did was to regulate things or to give people whose marriages had already collapsed the opportunity. I do think a lot of that is economic though, because with the best will in the world, okay, so you can get a divorce, but sure, like how many people in rural Ireland especially could afford two houses,
But not just that, as well what it's like in small towns. What was a woman going to do, especially maybe a woman of Izzy's age at that particular time in her life? What am I going to rent an apartment on the main street of the town and it's 1,000 people? Would there even be accommodation? No. How do you start a life again? What am I going to do? and someone of Izzy's sort of class as well. What about, it's okay for Anne Diver to work in the hotel.
Yeah, that was interesting. That dynamic in that relationship is kind of interesting, isn't it? That Sean, who's like the fellow with all the money and everything, and his girlfriend is this woman who sort of keeps herself well, but she's a waitress in the hotel.
Yeah, she is. Yeah. She's respectable, but
she's also there's a sort of chasteness about her too, which is I guess forced on her by her widowhood at a young age.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter whether Izzy gets divorced. Izzy's never going to go and work in a hotel.
Not at all. Exactly.
Absolutely no intention whatsoever.
Yeah. And also even with Colette, when Colette turns up and the money's running out, she's not rushing to get a job gutting fish or something down at the harbour. She's still floating around the place doing her creative writing classes and stuff. Yeah.
Her big skirts and her cashmere jumpers.
Big skirts and her jumpers. Yeah. It's great. So what are you working on at the moment? I don't want to say, I don't want to put you off, because sometimes when people ask me that, I nearly have a heart attack, because it's like, oh God, I'm not entirely sure, and I can talk myself out of it.
No, I'll give you as vague an answer as I can. I am writing another novel. I think it carries on a lot of the same themes. It actually focuses on a dynamic between two women. However, I've gone so far in one direction, though. Now I am writing a first-person narrative from the perspective of an 82-year-old woman who is a bit of a monster, and she is trying to leave an account of an incident that happened in her past before she dies to clarify some points.
Oh, interesting.
A psychological study than The Coast Road. And you know what? I can say that I'm quite deep into it, and I still don't know if I can make it work. I don't know.
You can, though. And also, I think if your publisher bought 2 books from you, you'll just make it work.
Oh no, they didn't.
Did they not?
No, just one. So
okay. So there's a bit of freedom in that then.
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good crack. So Alan, it's really a stunning book, and I hope everybody runs out and buys loads of copies and gives them to all the people they know. And it was really brilliant to talk to you, and the very best of luck over the next while.
Thank you so much.
And for the lovely reading. I'm sure it's going to have people rushing out to buy it. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to talk to you.